I only have a couple of shapes left to do before my poster is fairly well laid out. Obviously, it's not that much to look at yet, so I'd probably want to make some changes, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. The next easiest shape to make is going to be the spiral, and that's because there is a tool for that in Illustrator's tool set. It used to be a part of the shape tool that we've been using right here, but it was moved in more recent releases, and so now you just come down to this little ellipsis menu here and you can search for it, but it still exists. It's right here. So I'm going to click the spiral tool, and then again I'm going to just try to make it around the same size, but you notice I have a choice as to the way that it's spinning. I can have it spinning clockwise, or I can have it spinning counterclockwise. Now this may have some meaning, so since we're talking about symbolism, it might be worth looking into. But for the purposes of this demo, I'm just going to go ahead and choose the clockwise one. Clockwise usually means progress or forward motion, so I think in this case that'll be okay. Now, in order to be able to see it, you notice it doesn't show up here, and that's because I need to give it a stroke, which is, again, Adobe speak for an outline. So with my stroke box here put into the foreground, if I click the little black color underneath, since that's been the color I've been using all this time, that will turn it black. And then again, I can use my alignment tools and my distribution tools to get this where I need it to be. So mine's right here, so all I have to do is select my spiral, and then I can shift select the text box that's associated with it. If I let go of shift and I click that text box again, then I can come back to my align tools and I can choose to align horizontally on center, and then my value for distribute spacing is still saved since I haven't changed it, so I can just click the vertical distribute space and my spiral is put exactly where I need for it to be. Now, one thing I want you to notice about the spiral, though, is in terms of hierarchy, as a result of it having a much lower contrast than all of the shapes that are set in this dark color, it looks a lot less important. It looks like it's way further back in the hierarchy. So this may not be the direction that we want to go with it so that it stands out. If you look at it, you notice it kind of looks like a seashell. So what we could possibly do is select it, and instead of giving it a black outline, maybe I remove that and I come back and I give it a black fill. Perhaps for the outline then, I might want to, let's see what happens if I increase the thickness of the stroke without adding a color. Basically what I'm trying to do is get some space here so it doesn't just look like a comma on its side or some sort of just a blob. So let me come back with my shape selected to my stroke tool, and that one might have, I think I saved it in my toolkit earlier, but let me take a look and see. Yes, just hidden back here behind some of the open panels. So if I come to stroke, since it has no color right now, these tools are not really activated. And you notice when I started to activate it, it assigned a color to it. So what I may want to do is assign the same color as the background for now. So I'm going to come to my swatch menu, which is right here. And I'm going to find that same kind of a light gray color that I've been using. I think that's one step too light. I don't know, that looks like maybe one step too dark. So let me come back. Yeah, to where it blends in and this starts to look like negative space. So what I might want to do is just come in and increase the width of that stroke until it's really obvious. The other thing I want to call your attention to, though, is you notice how by default these lines have this really flat end to them. And within the stroke panel you do have the ability to change that. And so sometimes a rounded end cap can just look a little bit more intentional, and it can look a little bit higher quality. So that's starting to look a little bit better. Now when I zoom out, again, it's kind of small compared, so I need to get its height to be consistent with the other. So I'm going to select it, and I'm going to come back to my transform panel. I'm going to make sure that my reference point is still the bottom center, and I can see that my height here is 1 instead of 1 1/4 that I've been using. So with constrained proportions. If I change this to 1 1/4, the width should change to keep that spiral in proportion. And I know now that it's technically correct, although when it's sitting next to this diamond, which is a lot wider, and just using a little bit more of the, the dark color in the foreground, it does look a little bit small, not quite as bad as the star, but it's getting there. And then the last things I need to do are some vertical and horizontal lines, as well as the heart. I'm going to go ahead and do the heart, because really a heart essentially is just a square with 2 half circles on top of it. So what I could do is actually borrow my square and my circle. I'm going to select them both, and then I'm going to copy, and I'm going to paste them and move them over into the paste board over here so that I can work with them. And I'm going to use the alignment and distribution tools for this as well. I'm going to zoom in closer so we can get a better look at what we're doing. And I'm going to need 2 circles. So I'm going to copy this circle and paste a second version of it. And now this is going to be easier for me to do if I keep it straight up and down like this for now, and then when I'm finished I can rotate it 45 degrees to have it sitting where the point of the heart is at the bottom. So what I'm first going to do is select this circle and this square, and I'm going to make the square my key object, and I'm going to come back to my alignment tools, and I'm first going to make sure that they are aligned along the bottom so that these match up. I already know they're the same height and width because a square and a circle both have the same dimensions. So I know that these are both at 1 1/4 in both, the horizontal and vertical axis. But now I need to handle my distribute spacing here, because there's nothing that really allows me to align the center of this to the edge of this. Now, I do have the ability to move them a little bit closer with some of these tools, but overall what I'm going to want to do is use my horizontal distribute space for this. In order to activate it, you notice it's not active right now, and that's because I am currently aligning to the artboard as far as this panel is concerned. I think that's a bug in Illustrator because I obviously have a key object selected, and I can't even select that here until I choose to align to selection, and then the key object becomes available. So I can make sure that I'm aligning to that. And in this case, I know that this is 1 1/4 wide. So I'm going to need to do a little bit of math to get this to work out, but it should be roughly half of that to move it separately, right? So if I were to align these both on center, for example, you see how they both kind of overlap with each other. And the circle was being treated as the key object. Let me do that again to where the circle's here in the middle. And then now what I want to do is just move that circle further away from the center to where the top, or really in this case the right half of it, aligns with the right edge of the square. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my 1 1/4 and I'm going to divide that in half. We did that earlier because that's not as easy of a calculation. It's not a number most of us are used to. So I was figuring 1/2 of an inch is going to be 4/8, right? And 1/2 of a quarter is 5/8, or well, 1/8. So 4/8 plus 1/8 is 5/8. So I can allow Illustrator to do the math for me if I just type in 5/8 and then hit enter or kind of move around. It will calculate it for me, and now I can check and see if I did that right by clicking my horizontal distribute space button. You can see that that was way too far. It moved it a lot further than I wanted it to. And so I need to take care of that. Let me see about, oh, it's doing it from edge to edge. That's right. So it just put this 0.625 in between them. Let me see if I make that a negative number. So I'm going to type in minus 0.625 and try that again. You see, now it starts to click into shape. And so in this case, I can move this one as well, and it's okay that it's over here. It didn't have to be over here, as long as I make sure that I rotate this properly when I'm done. So now I'm done with that circle. So I'm going to select this circle and my square. Again, I want my square to be my key object, and I am going to now align these along their centers here. So horizontal center. And then I'm going to do the same distribute spacing, but this time I'm going to do a vertical distribute space. and that should lock them together. Now again, what I have here is not a heart. I have a square and two circles that overlap. And I think probably at this point in your understanding of the software, you're aware that you can group these things. So I could select all of these and I could group them, but they're still not really a single shape. Now I can select them all together, but there's still two circles and a square instead of an actual heart shape. So what I'm going to do instead is select all of these. I'm going to come over to my Pathfinder tool, which we will explore in greater detail later in the semester, by the way. And I'm just going to come to my shape modes and unite. And what that does is it creates a single shape from this to where I'm no longer dealing with multiple shapes that are at a greater risk of being moved around or distorted in some way. And then if I, while using my selection tool, that's the black arrow, if I hover around one of the corners, you notice it turns into a rotate tool. So what I can do is I can click that and hold, and if I hold down Shift, this will rotate at only 90 degrees, 180 degrees, or 45 degrees. So it goes at what we would consider kind of the critical numbers around a circle, or some of the more basic numbers around a circle. The other issue that I might run into is if I want to resize this to be 1 1/4 inches tall, the bounding box might be what gets resized for that rather than the heart itself. So I might have a little bit of trouble resizing this, but I can try. And I can see here that right now this height is saying 1.95. Let me see what happens if I change it to 1.25. And it definitely becomes smaller, but again, that might be resizing the bounding box. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to use a different tool. Instead of the selection tool, I'm going to use the white arrow, which is called the direct selection tool. And it's just slightly different in what it selects and how it works. So now I've got this selected and it's still telling me I've got this height of 1 1/4 inches. So that might have worked. Let me see what happens. I'm going to zoom back out. I'm going to switch back to my selection tool, which is the black arrow. I'm going to select the heart, and then I'm going to go and find my heart text box here. I'm going to hold down Shift to select. I'm going to release Shift, and I'm going to select the text box again so that it becomes my key object. And then I'm going to align on center. And since I just changed the distribute spacing to build the heart, I'm going to need to change this value back to 1/8 of an inch, which is 0.125. And click my vertical distribute space again. And it looks like it did get the height right and that it didn't deal with the bounding box, so that's helpful. Okay, so this will be a really good time to save. I'm almost done with my basic layout. This is starting to look, like it's coming together and almost finished. Obviously, there are some things that we would want to work on in terms of these boxes that have less text. It creates kind of a different weight on the page. But we don't always get a choice in that. So if we were doing a project for ourselves, we might try to edit the content, but that might not be an option if we're working for someone. So we'll talk about that a little bit later too. But let's go ahead and I'm going to handle one of these. I'm going to do either the vertical or horizontal lines, and then I'll let you do the other as a function of review so that you can practice on your own. Let's see, let's go with the vertical lines. Go ahead and finish up this top row here. You have some choices here. Now I could either create a set of vertical lines that were all the same thickness with all the same amount of space in between them. Or I might want to see what happens if I create lines where the thickness changes to where it kind of slowly builds or slowly recedes as far as the thickness of each line. So let's go ahead and see what we've got going on for that though. Either way, I'm going to start with a single line, and I'm not going to do this using my rectangle tool. I actually want to do this using a line segment. So what I can do instead for this is within my shape tool, I do have line segment as a choice. And I could also potentially use the pen tool here to create this. For now, I am going to use my line segment tool, and I'm going to let my smart guides approximate the height. But after I click once, I'm going to need to click and hold, and I'm going to hold down Shift. And that way, again, my line moves what's called orthogonally. So it only moves up and down, side to side, or at 45-degree angles. And I can trust my smart guides to get me close to the same height as the triangle, but then of course I am going to want to come back to my transform tool and just make sure that I did get that 1.25 inches, and I'm going to want to realign this just to make sure it's right as well. And what I can do now is I can go back to that stroke tool to thicken the line. So I'm going to give this a black stroke. Now I can either go to my swatches and find it, or if I wanted to, I could double click on this and it's going to open a palette. Right now it's already set to black, and you notice I can't actually go to my color swatches this way too and choose black. And what I'm going to do is create a thicker line here. I'm going to go around 6 points right now. And we can use a different function of the distribution tools to do this as well. So what I could do is I could just copy this and paste it. And then maybe, how many do we want? Maybe at least 8, right? Maybe 10. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 total. They're all one on top of the other. But the way that I could distribute these could be if I take one of these and I put it off towards the edge where I want it to be. And then perhaps I would select all of them. Curious as to why that's... Oh, I got the title here too, or the text box with the title in the opening paragraph. So I'm going to shift and click to deselect it. And now I have all of these, so I could again select a key object, and I can align them along the bottom so they all sit in the same place. And then I can deselect that key object, so shift and select again. And by aligning to my selection, I could have these distribute horizontally on center. And when I do that, they're all equally spaced apart. So I didn't have to do any math for that. I just needed to know what I wanted the width to be. And we can see that that looks okay. I might want to group them together. And then with those grouped, I can select their text box. And again, I can make it my key object, align on center. It's really important that I group these to do that because they need to be treated as a single unit. If I don't group them, I'm going to undo all of the work I just did. So if I take these and I ungroup them and I just select all of these and my text box, make my text box my key object, and then try to align it, it's going to center them all. So you see how it undoes everything I just did. So what I want to do is make sure they're grouped, and then select the text box, align them on center, and then do my distribute spacing to make sure that it's sitting the same distance off the top of that text box. And we can see that that looks pretty good. It's just really not that interesting to have all of these the same thickness. So what I might want to do for this is actually move them from thin to thick. So what I can do now, I can ungroup them for a little bit. That keystroke command, by the way, to group is Control-G, or Command-G on a Mac, and then to ungroup is Command-Shift-G. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to select this one, and I'm going to make it 1 point, or one's a little too thin. I'm going to go 2 point, and then for this one I'm going to go 3 point, and so on. Let's take this one down to 4 point, 5 point, and now this one is already 6 point. Let's take this one up to 7, this one up to 8, and this one up to 9. Now they're still distributed on center, so even though it's not the same amount of space in between, that's kind of what we're going for. We want it to kind of look almost like the IBM logo. And the IBM logo was supposed to be based on the bands of color on an old computer screen. Okay, here I'm not going to do the rounded cap because I actually think the straight cap is working here. So I'm going to leave it like that. And then I'm going to leave you to do the horizontal lines. And yes, of course, you could probably copy these, right? And rotate them. But I really want to encourage you to try to achieve the opposite effect by doing it from scratch and get a little bit of practice with using these tools, because especially the distribution tools can be very confusing at first, and any chance you have to practice you should take. So I'm going to pause the video. I'm going to complete that part with the video paused and encourage you to do the same thing, and we'll check back in just a minute. All right, so I've finished mine up here. Hopefully you have as well. I apologize for the notification beeps that were coming in as I was finishing up talking about the vertical lines. I should have taken care of that by now, and hopefully that won't happen again. But one thing I do want to call your attention to as well is that it looks like my vertical lines, let me turn off my hidden characters so that you can see without all the extra pieces there. It doesn't really look like these are actually centered, right? And that's because this thinner line at the end and having this thicker line on the other end is causing it to appear off balance, because right now these lines are being centered and they're being distributed based on their center point and not their edges. So we might want to do a little bit of adjustment here. And as well, the same thing's happening with the horizontal lines on the other axis. You notice that this sits just a little bit taller than all of the other shapes. It's not at exactly 1.25, and this is actually going to be sitting just a small fraction lower than the 1/8 of an inch off the top because of the thickness of the line as well. So one thing we may want to do to address those two issues is to convert these to shapes now that we're done. So a lot of times when you want to create a line of a certain thickness, or if you need to create a negative space of a certain thickness, it's actually a lot easier to create a line and to give it that weight as far as the stroke weight goes. But then sometimes you need to convert that into a series of rectangles or circles or whatever to be able to continue working with them. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to select all of my lines here. And I'm going to come to my object menu and I'm going to expand. And when I do that, it's asking me if I want to expand the fill and the stroke. I don't really have a fill, so I'm going to uncheck that, but I don't have to. It wouldn't really matter. I'm going to expand the stroke. And you notice that converts these into rectangles. So now I can group these again. Remember, that's Command G. And then I can shift select my text box again. And once I make this my key object, I might see a little bit of movement when I align on center this time. And sure enough, I actually saw a fair amount of movement. So these should now be aligned on center based on the edges of these lines rather than the center lines, and so that's going to look a little bit better. Likewise, I can come back and do the same thing with my horizontal lines to make sure that they are also aligning correctly with the other shapes in the row. I'm going to zoom in here, and I'm going to select all of my lines. I'm trying to make sure I don't have anything else selected. It looks like I do, because you can see how this bounding box is going higher. So I think this text box above has been selected. So I'm going to hold down Shift and click on that to deselect where it's just my lines. And again, I'm going to come to my object menu. I'm going to expand. I do not have a fill, so I can uncheck that. And when I do that, these are now treated as rectangles instead. And this time what I really need to do is make sure that I distribute them properly. So the first thing I can do is make sure that these are actually positioned off of the bottom of this thickness. So I'm going to select them all first. And again, I got that text box again. Deselect it. And I'm going to do a Command G to make sure these are all grouped, because then what I want to do is use my distribute spacing tool. I need to select my text box here as my key object, and then I can distribute spacing. You see how that pushes that up just a little bit. And then what I can do to make sure I continue to keep that same spacing, if you remember, I wanted these distributed on center, and I don't want to disturb that here. So what I can do next, though, is just adjust the height. So I can come back to my transform menu, and I can just make sure that these are actually 1.25 inches tall. And again, if I keep my reference point at the bottom center, then what this should do is scale them up just as far as they need to go. So I can type 1.25 in here. And that treats these shapes or these lines as a single shape, and just make sure that this stops at 1.25 inches. You notice now I have kind of a strange dimension here for the width. If that bothers you, which it probably does if you're studying design, what we can do is uncheck constrain proportions, and now we can change this back to, I had it at 1.5 inches, so I can change that back. And it should have sized in because my reference point is still on center here, so it shouldn't have changed anything that I've got in terms of my layout and my distribution of the shapes. So now when I zoom out, you can see that I've got a pretty decent beginning of a poster here. That being said, it's really not that aesthetically pleasing. It's not that interesting. So I would want to come back and change some of my typefaces, potentially some of my color choices. I might want to make some adjustments, but overall this is a pretty good start to be able to do all of that.